In a quiet farming region known as Riverbend Valley, most people followed the same daily routine. Farmers woke before sunrise. They worked their fields, and when harvest season arrived, they loaded their crops onto trucks and drove many miles to the nearest city market. It had been done that way for generations. The city market was large, busy, and full of traders who bought grain, vegetables, livestock, and fruit from farmers across the region. But there was one problem. The market was far away, sometimes more than 3 hours of driving. For small farmers, the journey was expensive. Fuel costs were high, roads were rough, and sometimes by the time they arrived, the prices had already dropped. Many farmers returned home disappointed. Yet despite these problems, no one ever questioned the system, because that was simply the way things had always worked. Except for one man. His name was Ethan Carter. Ethan was not the largest farmer in Riverbend Valley, but he was someone who paid attention to things most people ignored. Over the years, Ethan noticed something interesting. Every harvest season, hundreds of trucks left the valley carrying crops to the city market. But the valley itself had no central place where farmers could sell their goods. No trading center, no gathering point, no market at all. Everything produced in Riverbend Valley immediately left the valley. That idea stayed in Ethan's mind for months. Because if hundreds of farmers were already producing crops in the same region, then maybe the valley itself should have its own market. A place where buyers could come directly. Instead of farmers traveling to the city, traders could travel to the valley. But when Ethan mentioned this idea to other farmers, the reactions were almost always the same. They laughed. Why would traders come all the way out here? Another farmer shrugged. The city already has the big market. Someone else added, no one is going to drive here to buy vegetables. From their perspective, the idea made no sense. The valley had farms, but it didn't have a city. It didn't have a large population. And without buyers, a market would simply be an empty field. But Ethan continued thinking about it. One evening, while driving along an old road that ran through the center of the valley, he noticed something. The road connected 3 major farming areas. It was also the shortest route between 2 nearby cities. Hundreds of trucks already passed through that road every week. And suddenly, the idea became clearer. If a market existed beside that road, it wouldn't only serve the farmers. It could attract traders traveling between the cities. That thought changed everything. A few months later, Ethan made a decision that surprised everyone in Riverbend Valley. He bought a large piece of land beside that road. The location sat exactly between the major farms of the valley. And then he began building something no one expected. A market, not a small roadside stall. A real agricultural trading market. Large open sheds where farmers could unload their crops. Rows of wooden stalls. Storage warehouses. Parking areas for trucks. By the time construction finished, the place looked like it belonged in a much larger town. But there was one big problem. There were no traders. The first day the market opened, only a few farmers arrived. They placed baskets of vegetables on the empty stalls. They waited. Hours passed. No buyers came. By the afternoon, the farmers quietly packed their goods and left. The next week was the same. A few farmers arrived, but the market remained mostly empty. And soon, the valley began talking. At the small cafe near the road, farmers gathered every morning discussing the same thing. Did you see Ethan's new market? Someone laughed. A big market with no buyers. Another farmer shook his head. He built the biggest empty building in the valley. And slowly, the nickname spread. People began calling it the empty market. But Ethan didn't seem worried. Every week, he opened the market again. Farmers brought their crops. Stalls were arranged neatly. The sheds stayed ready, even when most of them remained empty. Because Ethan believed something the others didn't. Markets don't appear busy on the first day. They grow slowly. The real question was whether traders would ever come to Riverbend Valley. And if they didn't, Ethan Carter might have just built the most expensive mistake in the valley's history. For the next several months, Ethan Carter opened the Riverbend market every week. Every Saturday morning before sunrise, he unlocked the large wooden gates at the entrance. The sheds stood ready. Rows of empty stalls waited beneath the long metal roofs. Wide gravel paths stretched across the market yard, designed for trucks and tractors to move easily between the stalls. Everything looked exactly like a proper trading market. Except for one thing. There were almost no buyers. A few farmers from nearby fields began bringing their vegetables and grain. They unloaded baskets of tomatoes, crates of potatoes, bundles of fresh greens. For a few hours they waited, but most of the stalls remained empty. Sometimes a single trader from the nearby town would arrive and buy a small amount of produce. But that was all. Nothing like the busy city markets farmers were used to. And every week when the sun began to set, the same scene repeated itself. Farmers quietly packed their unsold goods back into their trucks. Engines started. Dust rose from the road, and the Riverbend market slowly became empty again. After a few weeks, some farmers stopped coming. "It's a waste of time," one of them said. "We can't wait all day hoping someone shows up." Others agreed. The city market was far away, but at least there were always buyers. Here, there was only uncertainty. Soon, the conversations around the valley became more critical. At the small roadside cafe where farmers gathered each morning, the jokes became louder. "Did you hear Ethan opened the market again yesterday?" Someone laughed. "How many traders came this time?" Another farmer answered sarcastically, "2 goats and a stray dog." The table burst into laughter. Even some of Ethan's friends began questioning him. One afternoon, a farmer named Daniel approached Ethan while he was sweeping dust from the market walkway. Daniel looked around the empty stalls. "Ethan," he said carefully, "you built a beautiful market. No one is denying that. But markets only work if buyers come." Ethan nodded slowly. "I know," Daniel continued. "Maybe you should stop opening it every week. Wait until you can attract traders first." But Ethan didn't close the market. Instead, he did something different. He started improving it. During the next few weeks, workers appeared at Riverbend Market again. They built larger storage sheds so farmers could keep crops fresh overnight. They installed shaded areas for livestock trading. Ethan even added a small cafe stand so visitors could buy food and tea while trading. The market began looking more complete, more professional, more like the trading centers found in large agricultural regions. Still, the traders did not come. But Ethan wasn't only improving the buildings. He was also doing something no one in the valley noticed. Every week, he traveled to nearby cities. He visited food distributors, restaurant supply companies, wholesale produce buyers, and he told them the same thing. Riverbend Valley produces some of the best crops in the region. Instead of buying from middlemen in the city, you can come directly to the farmers. Some buyers listened politely. Others simply said the trip was too far. But a few of them became curious, because Ethan offered them something different. Direct access to farms, lower prices, and a central market where farmers would gather every week. Slowly, a few traders agreed to visit. Not many, just a handful, but it was a start. Meanwhile, the farmers of Riverbend Valley continued watching from a distance. From the outside, the market still looked empty most days. The stalls still sat quiet, and the jokes continued. The empty market, they called it. But Ethan Carter didn't seem discouraged, because he understood something about markets that most people forgot. Markets don't become busy overnight. They grow through trust, through routine, through the slow realization that trade can happen there. And Ethan believed that once traders arrived, even once, they might return again. But everything depended on whether those first traders would ever show up. Because if they didn't, Riverbend Market might remain exactly what everyone believed it was. An empty place in the middle of a farming valley, waiting for buyers who might never come. For nearly a year after the Riverbend Market opened, the routine in the valley remained almost the same. Farmers still drove long distances to the city. The sheds of the new market still stood quiet most days. And the nickname, the Empty Market, continued spreading across the region. But Ethan Carter never stopped opening the gates. Every Saturday morning before sunrise, he arrived at the market before anyone else. He unlocked the entrance, walked through the long rows of wooden stalls, checked the storage sheds, and made sure everything was ready, even if very few people came. Because Ethan believed something simple. A market had to exist before it could grow. And if the farmers of Riverbend Valley ever stopped showing up completely, traders would never come at all. So week after week, a small group of farmers continued arriving. Not many, but enough to keep the market alive. And then, one morning, something different happened. Just after sunrise, a large delivery truck appeared on the road leading into the valley. The truck slowed as it approached the wooden gate of Riverbend Market. Several farmers unloading vegetables stopped and looked toward the entrance. They weren't used to seeing large trading trucks here. The vehicle rolled into the market yard and parked beside the first row of stalls. A man stepped out. He was a produce buyer from one of the nearby cities. He walked slowly through the stalls, looking at the vegetables farmers had arranged on the tables. Tomatoes, cabbage, fresh onions, green peppers. After a few minutes, he began asking questions. How much for these? Are these grown here in the valley? The farmers exchanged surprised looks. For the first time since the market opened, someone had actually come to buy. By mid-morning, the buyer had filled the back of his truck with produce from several farmers. Before leaving, he spoke briefly with Ethan. If the crops are always this fresh, the trader said, I might come back next week. That single sentence changed everything. Because traders rarely traveled alone, they shared information. They talked to other buyers. And 1 week later, something unusual happened again. 2 trucks arrived, then 3. Within a few weeks, a small but steady group of traders began visiting Riverbend Market every Saturday. At first, the activity was modest, but it was enough to change the mood in the valley. Farmers who had stopped coming began returning. They brought larger quantities of crops. More stalls opened. More tables filled with vegetables, grains, and fruit. The sheds that once stood empty slowly began filling with life. Soon, the market looked very different from the quiet place it had once been. Trucks arrived early in the morning. Farmers unloaded baskets of produce. Buyers walked through the rows negotiating prices. Engines started and stopped as trucks loaded goods for delivery to nearby cities. The Riverbend Market was finally becoming what Ethan had imagined from the beginning. A place where farmers and traders met directly. And once the market reached that point, something else began happening. Word spread beyond Riverbend Valley. Traders from farther cities heard about a new place where fresh crops could be purchased directly from farmers. Restaurant suppliers began arriving. Wholesale food distributors started sending trucks. Even livestock traders began using the market to buy animals from nearby farms. Within 2 years, the place once known as the Empty Market had become the busiest agricultural trading center in the entire region. The gravel yard was full of trucks every Saturday. Farmers who once drove hours to the city now sold their goods only a few miles from home. Fuel costs dropped, profits improved, and Riverbend Valley slowly began growing into something new. Small shops opened beside the market road. Food stalls appeared to serve workers and traders. Storage warehouses expanded, and what had once been an empty field became the center of economic life for the entire valley. One afternoon, as the market buzzed with activity, a young reporter visited Ethan Carter. The reporter looked across the crowded stalls where traders and farmers negotiated prices while forklifts moved crates across the yard. It's hard to believe, the reporter said, that people once called this place the Empty Market. Ethan smiled slightly. Markets always look empty in the beginning. People only believe in them after they grow. The reporter asked the question many people in the valley had wondered for years. How did you know traders would eventually come here? Ethan looked across the market for a moment before answering. I didn't know. I only knew something simple. Farmers were already producing food here. And wherever goods exist, trade eventually follows. As the sun set over Riverbend Valley that evening, trucks continued leaving the market loaded with fresh crops. Farmers packed their empty baskets. Traders counted their purchases. And the place that once stood silent had become the heart of the valley. All because one man built the market before anyone believed it was needed. Sometimes opportunity doesn't appear after success. Sometimes success only appears because someone was willing to build first and wait, watching from a distance. From the outside, the market still looked empty most days. The stalls still sat quiet. And the jokes continued. The empty market, they called it. But Ethan Carter didn't seem discouraged. Because he understood something about markets that most people forgot. Markets don't become busy overnight. They grow through trust, through routine, through the slow realization that trade can happen there. And Ethan believed that once traders arrived, even once, they might return again. But everything depended on whether those first traders would ever show up. Because if they didn't, Riverbend Market might remain exactly what everyone believed it was. An empty place in the middle of a farming valley, waiting for buyers who might never come. For nearly a year after the Riverbend Market opened, the routine in the valley remained almost the same. Farmers still drove long distances to the city. The sheds of the new market still stood quiet most days. And the nickname, the Empty Market, continued spreading across the region. But Ethan Carter never stopped opening the gates. Every Saturday morning before sunrise, he arrived at the market before anyone else. He unlocked the entrance. walked through the long rows of wooden stalls, checked the storage sheds, and made sure everything was ready, even if very few people came. Because Ethan believed something simple. A market had to exist before it could grow. And if the farmers of Riverbend Valley ever stopped showing up completely, traders would never come at all. So week after week, a small group of farmers continued arriving. Not many, but enough to keep the market alive. And then, one morning, something different happened. Just after sunrise, a large delivery truck appeared on the road leading into the valley. The truck slowed as it approached the wooden gate of Riverbend Market. Several farmers unloading vegetables stopped and looked toward the entrance. They weren't used to seeing large trading trucks here. The vehicle rolled into the market yard and parked beside the first row of stalls. A man stepped out. He was a produce buyer from one of the nearby cities. He walked slowly through the stalls, looking at the vegetables farmers had arranged on the tables. Tomatoes, cabbage, fresh onions, green peppers. After a few minutes, he began asking questions. How much for these? Are these grown here in the valley? The farmers exchanged surprised looks. For the first time since the market opened, someone had actually come to buy. By mid-morning, the buyer had filled the back of his truck with produce from several farmers. Before leaving, he spoke briefly with Ethan. If the crops are always this fresh, the trader said, I might come back next week. That single sentence changed everything. Because traders rarely traveled alone. They shared information. They talked to other buyers. For nearly a century, the town existed for one reason. Coal. Everything here revolved around the mine. The long black trains that left before sunrise. The rumble of trucks moving through narrow streets. The constant hum of machines working beneath the earth. For generations, the mine was more than an employer. It was the town's identity. Families built their lives around it. Fathers taught their sons how to work underground. Local diners opened before dawn to serve miners heading to early shifts. The school football team was called the Miners. The town had grown around a single industry, and for a long time, it worked. Thousands of workers passed through the mine gates every day. Small businesses thrived along Main Street. Houses were full. Schools were crowded. It was the kind of town where almost everyone knew someone who worked underground. But industries built on a single foundation often share the same fate. And one winter morning, everything changed. The announcement came quietly. A short statement from the mining company's headquarters. Production costs were rising. Global energy markets were shifting. Demand for coal had been declining for years. The mine would close. Not slowly. Not over several years. Immediately. After nearly 90 years of operation, the mine that built the town would shut down within 6 months. At first, many people refused to believe it. The mine had survived recessions, labor strikes, energy shortages, generations of economic change. People assumed this announcement would pass like the others. But this time it didn't. Within weeks, equipment began disappearing from the mine. Heavy machinery was removed. Trucks stopped arriving. Sections of the underground tunnels were sealed. And slowly, the truth became impossible to ignore. The town's only industry was disappearing. When the final shift ended, hundreds of workers walked out of the mine gates for the last time. Some had worked there for 30 years. Others had only recently started their careers. But they all faced the same future. Uncertainty. The economic shock spread quickly. Without the mine's payroll, local businesses began struggling almost immediately. Restaurants lost customers. Hardware stores saw fewer sales. Property values dropped. Families began leaving. Moving trucks appeared on quiet streets. Houses went up for sale. Shops closed earlier and earlier each evening. Within 2 years, nearly a third of the town's population had gone. The mine entrance, once crowded with workers, stood silent behind locked gates. People started saying something that echoed through the region. The town is finished. Places like this rarely survive when their main industry disappears. History had shown it again and again. Mining towns collapse when the mines close. But while many people were leaving, one person was paying attention to something others ignored. His name was Daniel Carter. Daniel Carter was 36 years old, a mechanical engineer who had grown up just outside the town. His father had spent 25 years working inside the coal mine before retiring early due to a back injury. Daniel understood what the mine meant to the community. He had grown up hearing stories about life underground, about the teamwork miners relied on, about the pride people felt knowing their work powered entire cities. But Daniel had chosen a different path. Instead of working in the mine, He studied engineering and eventually built a career designing industrial machinery for manufacturing companies in larger cities. For years, he had watched the coal industry decline. He had seen the numbers. Energy markets were changing. Environmental regulations were tightening. New technologies were replacing old ones. Daniel knew something the town did not want to accept. The coal industry was not coming back. But when he returned home one autumn afternoon, something about the empty mine caught his attention. The facility was enormous. Miles of underground tunnels, massive industrial buildings, rail connections, heavy power infrastructure, large transport roads designed for mining trucks. Most people looked at the site and saw a dead industry. Daniel saw something else. Infrastructure. Infrastructure that had taken decades to build. Infrastructure that could support something entirely different. Standing near the silent mine entrance, Daniel studied the enormous steel structures rising above the valley. The processing plant, the rail yard, the maintenance workshops. And slowly, a question formed in his mind. What if the town didn't need another mine? What if the infrastructure could support a completely different industry? It was an idea that sounded almost ridiculous. Coal towns did not reinvent themselves. They disappeared. But Daniel couldn't ignore what he was seeing. The rail lines could transport heavy goods. The industrial buildings could house large equipment. The power grid designed for mining operations could support major manufacturing facilities. And the town still had something else. A workforce. Hundreds of people experienced in operating heavy machinery, maintaining equipment, and managing industrial systems. The more Daniel thought about it, the more the idea began to grow. Maybe the mine's closing wasn't the end of the town's story. Maybe it was the beginning of something else. But turning that idea into reality would require something far more difficult than imagining it. It would require convincing others, investors, engineers, companies, and most importantly, an entire town that had already begun to lose hope. Because Daniel Carter was about to suggest something almost no one believed was possible. Replacing coal with a completely new industry. And if he failed, the town would disappear for good. When Daniel Carter first explained his idea, the reactions were almost always the same. Silence, then skepticism, and sometimes quiet laughter. Replacing a coal mine was not something towns simply did. Mines created entire local economies. Once they disappeared, the communities built around them usually followed. But Daniel wasn't trying to bring coal back. He was thinking about something very different. Energy. Not the kind pulled from underground, but the kind built above it. For years, Daniel had worked in industrial manufacturing plants across several states. During that time, he had watched something interesting happen. Energy companies were changing. Wind farms were expanding across rural landscapes. Solar installations were appearing across former industrial land. Governments were offering incentives for renewable infrastructure projects. And one industry in particular was growing faster than anyone expected. Wind turbine manufacturing. Modern wind turbines were enormous machines. The towers alone could reach heights taller than skyscrapers. Their components were massive, steel towers, giant nacelles housing generators, and blades longer than airplane wings. Building these machines required something very specific. Large industrial facilities, rail connections, heavy power infrastructure, and a workforce skilled in mechanical systems. Exactly the kind of infrastructure the coal mine had already created. Daniel began researching the possibility. The mine's processing plant buildings could be converted into turbine assembly facilities. The rail yard could transport turbine towers to wind farm sites across the region. The heavy equipment workshops could manufacture and repair industrial components. And perhaps most importantly, the town's former miners already possessed valuable skills. Operating heavy machinery, maintaining complex mechanical systems, working in dangerous industrial environments. The more Daniel studied the idea, the more realistic it began to look. But turning an idea into reality required something far more difficult. Investment. Converting a coal facility into a manufacturing hub would cost millions. And convincing investors to bet on a dying mining town was not an easy conversation. Daniel spent months traveling between cities, meeting with energy companies and manufacturing executives. Most meetings ended quickly. The same concerns appeared again and again. The town was too remote. The workforce was shrinking. The local economy was unstable. And the mine's reputation as a declining industry town made investors nervous. But Daniel refused to give up. He kept refining his proposal. Instead of presenting the town as a former mining community, he started describing it differently, as an industrial site ready for reinvention, a location where infrastructure already existed, where manufacturing space could be created faster and cheaper than building new facilities from scratch. Eventually, one meeting changed everything. It was a small renewable energy manufacturing company looking to expand production of wind turbine components. They had been searching for a location large enough to assemble turbine towers. But most industrial zones near major cities were too expensive. When Daniel showed them the abandoned mine facilities, they were surprised. The buildings were enormous. The rail yard connected directly to major freight lines. The heavy-duty roads built for mining trucks could easily support turbine transport vehicles. And the local workforce was eager for new opportunities. For the first time since the mine had closed, someone looked at the town and saw potential. The company agreed to explore the possibility. But there was still one problem. The town itself. Many residents were skeptical about the idea of replacing the coal industry with renewable energy manufacturing. Coal had built their community. Generations of families had worked in the mine. To some, the idea of wind turbines replacing coal felt like abandoning their history. Daniel understood that concern. He knew the mine represented pride, identity, and decades of hard work. So he made one thing very clear during community meetings. This wasn't about erasing the past. It was about protecting the future. The town needed jobs, and those jobs needed to come from somewhere. Slowly, attitudes began to shift. Former miners attended training programs to learn new mechanical skills related to turbine assembly. Local contractors began repairing the mine's industrial buildings. Rail lines were inspected and restored. And after months of negotiations, the renewable energy company made its decision. They would build their new turbine manufacturing facility in the town. For the first time since the mine had closed, real construction began again. Crane trucks returned. Industrial equipment arrived. The silent mine complex started filling with workers. At first, only a few dozen people were hired. But something had changed. The town that had been slowly fading away suddenly had a new possibility. And Daniel Carter's idea, the one that once sounded impossible, was about to begin transforming the entire region. Because what happened next would prove that a town built on coal could build something entirely different. And this time, the future would be powered by the wind. In the first months after construction began, the town still felt uncertain. People had seen promises before. Mining companies had made announcements that never materialized. Outside investors had talked about redevelopment projects that quietly disappeared. Many residents waited to see if this would be any different. At first, the changes were small. Construction crews repaired the old processing buildings. Rusted conveyor systems were removed. Sections of the facility were redesigned to hold massive turbine assembly lines. The coal mine's towering structures slowly transformed into something new. Where coal had once been sorted and transported, giant steel turbine towers were now being assembled. Where miners once clocked in for underground shifts, technicians began arriving to operate precision manufacturing equipment. The same industrial infrastructure that once supported coal extraction was now supporting renewable energy production. For many former miners, the transition was emotional. Some had spent decades underground. Working in a turbine factory was very different. But the skills they had developed in the mine proved valuable. Mechanical knowledge, heavy equipment operation, safety discipline, team coordination in demanding industrial environments. Training programs helped workers learn the new systems. Within a year, the factory employed more than 100 people. For a town that had been steadily losing jobs, it was the first real sign of recovery. But the real transformation began during the second year. The renewable energy industry was growing faster than anyone expected. Wind farms were expanding across the country. Governments were increasing renewable energy targets. Energy companies were ordering more turbines than manufacturers could produce. The small facility Daniel helped bring to town suddenly faced a new problem. Demand. Orders kept increasing, and the factory needed to expand. The company announced plans to build additional assembly lines inside the old mine complex. New equipment arrived. More workers were hired. Former miners who had moved away began hearing about the new jobs. Some of them came back. Houses that had sat empty for years were suddenly occupied again. The grocery store that had nearly closed started seeing customers return. Restaurants extended their hours. The school district gained new students. The town that once believed its future had disappeared with the coal mine began discovering something unexpected: reinvention. By the third year, the turbine manufacturing facility had become one of the largest employers in the region. Massive steel tower sections were produced inside the renovated mine buildings. From there, the components were loaded onto specialized rail cars in the old mining rail yard. The same rail lines that once transported coal now carried wind turbine towers to construction sites across the country. It was a transformation few people could have imagined. The town that once powered cities with coal was now helping power them with renewable energy. And the economic impact continued growing. New businesses started appearing around the town: engineering contractors, maintenance service companies, logistics firms, training centers for renewable energy technicians. Each new company created more jobs. Each new job brought more families back to the area. Within 5 years, the town's population had stabilized. Then something even more remarkable happened. It began growing. Young engineers moved to the town for work in renewable energy manufacturing. Former miners trained as turbine technicians. Students who once believed they would need to leave town to find careers suddenly had opportunities close to home. The transformation extended beyond the factory. Main Street began changing too. New cafes opened where closed shops once stood. A technology training center opened in a renovated building near the town square. Local schools introduced engineering and renewable energy programs to prepare students for new careers. The town that once depended entirely on coal had developed a completely different identity. An energy town, but not the kind anyone expected. By the 7th year, the turbine manufacturing facility had expanded across much of the former mine property. More than 500 people worked there. The rail yard operated daily shipments. The industrial buildings once built for coal extraction had become one of the region's most important renewable energy manufacturing hubs. And Daniel Harper, the engineer who first imagined the possibility, still worked quietly behind the scenes. He rarely appeared in public interviews. When journalists asked him how he had predicted the town's transformation, he always gave the same answer. He didn't predict the future. He simply saw opportunity in infrastructure others had written off. The mine had not been useless after it closed. It had been waiting for someone to imagine a different use for the things it left behind. The rail lines, the buildings, the power grid, the skilled workers. All the pieces had already been there. They just needed a new purpose. Today, if you drive through the town early in the morning, the scene looks very different from the quiet streets that followed the mine's closure years ago. Workers arrive before sunrise. Freight trains move through the rail yard carrying massive turbine components. Industrial cranes rise above the old mine complex, now filled with manufacturing activity. And on the hills outside town, something new has appeared. Wind turbines. Tall white towers turning slowly in the morning breeze. Machines built inside the very town that once believed its future had disappeared underground. The coal mine is still there. Its entrance sealed. Its tunnels silent. A reminder of the industry that built the town. But nearby, a new industry is moving. One that did not replace the town's past. It grew from it. Because sometimes, the end of one industry is not the end of a place. Sometimes it's the beginning of the next chapter. There was a time when the valley was alive. Not famous. Not rich. But alive. Morning smoke rose from chimneys like quiet signals of life. Trucks rolled down the narrow road before sunrise. Store doors opened with the sound of old metal bells. Farmers waved to factory workers. Mechanics drank coffee before the first engine started. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other. The valley had one river, one highway, and one factory that kept everything moving. For nearly 40 years, that factory was the heartbeat of the entire region. It built agricultural equipment, heavy machines that farmers across the country relied on. Every morning, hundreds of workers filled the parking lot. Welding sparks flashed behind steel doors. Delivery trucks lined the road like a convoy of opportunity. The town lived on those paychecks. Then one year, everything changed. The company announced it would relocate production overseas. Cheaper labor, bigger profit margins, corporate language that sounded clean and logical on paper. But in the valley, it meant something else. Silence. Within 6 months, the factory shut down. The machines were dismantled. Office lights went dark. Trucks stopped arriving. And the valley began to empty. Families packed moving trucks. Houses went up for sale. Local shops closed their doors one by one. The diner that once served breakfast to factory workers started opening later, then eventually stopped opening at all. The school lost students. The hardware store lost customers. The valley lost its reason to stay. Over the next 5 years, the population dropped by almost half. Grass grew through the cracks in the old factory parking lot. Wind moved through broken windows. The enormous building, once loud with industry, stood like a skeleton of the past. People who passed through called it a ghost valley. Most assumed the story was over. Places like this rarely come back. Once the jobs disappear, the people follow. Once the people leave, businesses collapse. And when that cycle begins, it rarely reverses. But the valley still had one resident who refused to leave. His name was Lucas Bennett. Lucas Bennett was 38 years old, an industrial engineer who had grown up in the valley when the factory was still thriving. His father had worked there as a machinist for 22 years. Lucas remembered the valley differently. He remembered crowded football games under bright stadium lights, summer festivals near the river, pickup trucks parked outside diners filled with laughter and tired workers finishing long shifts. When the factory closed, Lucas had already left for college and built a career in a nearby city. Like many others, he assumed the valley would slowly disappear. Until one afternoon, when he drove back. The road into the valley felt unfamiliar. Gas stations were boarded up. Fields looked neglected. Empty houses sat quietly along the road like forgotten memories. When Lucas reached the old factory, he pulled his truck to the side of the road. The building was enormous. 600,000 square feet of rusting steel and silent machinery. Grass had swallowed half the parking lot. Windows were broken. The company logo still hung above the entrance, faded and peeling under the sun. Lucas stepped out of the truck. Wind moved through the empty structure with a hollow echo. For a moment, it looked like the valley's story had truly ended. Most people saw a ruin. Lucas saw something else. He saw infrastructure, rail access, highway proximity, industrial power lines, warehouses, machines that had been left behind, and something even more valuable, space. Cheap space. The kind of space businesses in crowded cities could never afford anymore. Standing there in the silence of the abandoned factory, a strange idea began to form. What if the valley wasn't finished? What if everyone had left too soon? Lucas walked through the broken front gate. Dust covered the floors inside. Old equipment stood frozen in place. A single shaft of sunlight fell through a cracked roof panel, illuminating a line of dormant assembly machines. It looked like time had simply stopped. And that's when the idea became a decision. Lucas didn't see a ghost town. He saw an opportunity no one else was looking at. A place where land was cheap. A place with existing infrastructure. A place where people would come back, if there was work again. But rebuilding a valley was not a simple plan. Buying the factory alone would require millions. Convincing companies to move there would be even harder. And everyone he talked to had the same response. They laughed. No investors wanted to touch a dead town. Banks refused the loans. Business partners told him he was chasing a fantasy. One friend said something Lucas would never forget. Places like that don't come back. But Lucas Bennett had grown up in that valley. He knew what it used to be, and he believed something most people didn't. Sometimes opportunity hides in the exact places everyone else abandons. The question wasn't whether the valley could come back. The question was whether one person could start it. So Lucas did something that surprised everyone. He made an offer to buy the factory. Not because it was profitable, but because he believed the valley's story wasn't over yet. And what happened next would change the entire region. When Lucas Bennett made the offer to buy the abandoned factory, almost no one believed it would actually happen. The building had been sitting empty for nearly 6 years. The previous owners had tried to sell it multiple times. Investors walked through the property, studied the numbers, and quietly walked away. Maintaining a structure that large without active production was expensive. The roof needed repairs. Electrical systems were outdated. Rust had started creeping across machines that once built thousands of agricultural parts every week. To most buyers, it looked like a financial disaster waiting to happen. But Lucas looked at the situation differently. Where others saw decay, he saw potential. And more importantly, he saw timing. Across the country, small manufacturers were struggling with rising rent in major industrial zones. Warehouses in cities were becoming unaffordable. Logistics costs were increasing every year. Companies needed space to build, store, and ship products. Lucas believed the valley could become something new. Not a single large factory like before, but a network of smaller businesses. A place where manufacturing, storage, and logistics companies could operate together. The idea was simple in theory. Turn the abandoned factory into a shared industrial hub. Divide the massive building into smaller sections. Renovate key areas. Offer affordable leases to companies that needed space. But the problem was money. Buying the factory required nearly every dollar Lucas had saved during his engineering career. The renovation would cost even more. Banks were still refusing to lend. The valley had no economic activity, no proven demand, no clear evidence that businesses would actually move there. To lenders, Lucas's plan looked like a gamble. But Lucas had something the banks didn't. He had patience. Instead of chasing large corporate investors, he started talking directly to small business owners, metal fabricators, equipment repair companies, agricultural suppliers, e-commerce storage operations. He visited workshops, industrial yards, and trade events across nearby cities. And everywhere he went, he heard the same complaint. We're running out of space. City rent was crushing small manufacturers. Many were operating out of cramped buildings where expansion was impossible. When Lucas showed them photos of the Valley factory, their reaction was always the same. They couldn't believe the size of it. But the next question was always the difficult one. Where is it? And when Lucas explained the location, the quiet valley where half the town had already moved away, the excitement usually faded. No one wanted to move to a place with no activity. No restaurants. No services. No workforce. No guarantee that the experiment would work. Lucas realized the valley had a classic problem. Businesses wouldn't move there because there were no jobs. But jobs wouldn't appear until businesses moved there. The cycle had to be broken somehow. So Lucas made a decision that surprised everyone again. Instead of waiting for companies to arrive, he started rebuilding first. He hired local contractors, many of them former factory workers who had been unemployed for years. The roof was repaired. Broken windows were replaced. Electrical systems were upgraded. The enormous interior was divided into smaller production zones. Slowly, light returned to sections of the building that had been dark for nearly a decade. For the first time in years, the factory parking lot had trucks again. Not delivery trucks. Construction trucks. People in the valley began to notice. At first, they assumed it was temporary. Maybe someone had bought the building to tear it down. Maybe a warehouse company was planning to store equipment there. But Lucas kept working. Every week, more repairs. More equipment. More activity. Word began to spread beyond the valley. An old factory was coming back to life. Then something unexpected happened. The first tenant arrived. It wasn't a giant corporation. It was a small agricultural parts manufacturer with 12 employees. Their city lease had doubled in price, and they needed space for larger machines. Lucas offered them something they couldn't find anywhere else. 10,000 square feet of production space. Affordable rent. Direct highway access. They moved in within 2 months. And suddenly, the valley had its first new jobs in nearly 10 years. The effect was immediate. Workers started commuting again. Gas stations reopened. The small diner near the highway turned its lights back on. A mechanic shop reopened its garage doors. The valley, which had been silent for years, began making noise again. Lucas knew one company wasn't enough. But it was proof. Proof that the idea could work. So he kept going. More renovations. More outreach to business owners. More conversations with companies desperate for affordable industrial space. 6 months later, 2 more businesses moved in. Then another. Then another. Within 2 years, the once abandoned factory had been transformed into something completely different. A cluster of independent businesses. Each one small, but together, powerful. Metal workers. Machine repair specialists. Agricultural suppliers. Packaging companies. Online retail storage operations. Each company hiring local workers. Each company bringing life back to the valley. And slowly, something remarkable began to happen. People started moving back. Houses that had been empty for years were suddenly occupied again. Schools began gaining students. Local businesses reopened their doors. The valley that had once been written off as finished was starting to breathe again. But Lucas Bennett's plan was still far from complete. Because what happened next would turn the valley into something no one had imagined. And it would prove that one decision, made when everyone else walked away, could transform an entire region. By the 3rd year, the valley looked different. Not completely transformed. Not yet, but different enough that people who had left began noticing something unusual. Lights were on again at the factory. At night, trucks could be seen entering the valley road. Delivery vans rolled in and out during the day. The once empty parking lot now had rows of vehicles belonging to welders, technicians, warehouse workers, mechanics, and office staff. The building that had once symbolized the valley's collapse had become the center of its revival. But Lucas Bennett wasn't trying to rebuild the past. He knew the valley could never return to the single-factory economy it once depended on. That system had collapsed the moment the corporation moved overseas. Instead, Lucas focused on something stronger. Diversification. Dozens of small businesses instead of one giant employer. Each company using a portion of the massive industrial complex. Each company growing at its own pace. And together, they created something far more stable than the valley had ever had before. The fourth tenant arrived after hearing about the project from another manufacturer. Then the fifth. Then the eighth. Within 3 years, nearly half the factory floor was operational again. The enormous building had been divided into independent sections, workshops, production areas, shipping zones, and storage facilities. The sound of machinery returned to the valley. Metal cutting, forklifts moving pallets, packaging lines sealing orders. For the first time in nearly a decade, the valley had real economic activity again. But the most surprising change was happening outside the factory. Local businesses began reopening. The old diner that once served factory workers every morning became busy again before sunrise. Truck drivers stopped there for coffee. Mechanics met customers over breakfast. Workers gathered after long shifts just like they had years before. A grocery store reopened. A small pharmacy followed. A construction company opened an office nearby to handle the growing demand for repairs and housing renovations. The valley's population started increasing for the first time in nearly 10 years. Some of the new residents were workers hired by the businesses inside Lucas's factory hub, but many were people who had left years earlier. They were coming back. Families who once believed the valley's story had ended began seeing a future there again. Lucas rarely talked about what he had built. He still worked quietly inside the factory complex, walking the floor, talking with business owners, fixing problems as they appeared. He was still wearing the same work boots and the same dark blue work shirt he had worn the day he first stepped inside the abandoned building. To him, the project was never about recognition. It was about proving something. That places people give up on too quickly sometimes still have value. But the true turning point came in the 5th year. That was when a regional logistics company visited the valley. They had heard about the cluster of small manufacturers operating inside the old factory. Their business depended on shipping products quickly between cities. When they saw the location, highway access, rail connections, and dozens of companies producing goods in one place, they realized something Lucas had already understood years earlier. The valley was becoming a logistics hub. The company built a distribution center on land just outside the factory property. Suddenly, the valley wasn't just producing goods. It was shipping them across the country. More jobs appeared. Truck drivers, warehouse coordinators, inventory managers, delivery crews. Within 2 years, the valley had more jobs than it had ever had during the old factory era. And unlike before, those jobs came from many different businesses. If one company struggled, the others kept operating. The economy was no longer fragile. It was resilient. 6 years after Lucas Bennett bought the abandoned factory, the transformation was undeniable. The building that once stood empty was now almost fully occupied. Over 20 companies operated inside the complex. Hundreds of workers arrived every morning. The valley that had nearly disappeared from the map was now growing again. Even real estate developers began paying attention. New housing construction started near the river. The school district expanded classrooms. The once forgotten valley had quietly become one of the fastest growing economic areas in the region. And yet, if you asked Lucas how it happened, his answer was always simple. He didn't say he saved the valley. He didn't claim he predicted everything that followed. He only said one thing. Everyone else left too soon. Because the truth was, the valley had never truly been empty. It had land, infrastructure, history, and people who still wanted a reason to stay. All it needed was someone willing to see opportunity where everyone else saw failure. Today, if you drive into the valley at sunrise, you'll see something very different from the silent roads that once defined it. Delivery trucks heading toward the factory. Workers parking their cars before early shifts. Small businesses opening their doors. And in the distance, a massive industrial building humming with activity again. The same building that once stood abandoned. The same building everyone believed would never be used again. All because one person looked at a dying valley and saw the beginning of something new, sat quietly along the road like forgotten memories. When Lucas reached the old factory, he pulled his truck to the side of the road. The building was enormous. 600,000 square feet of rusting steel and silent machinery. Grass had swallowed half the parking lot. Windows were broken. The company logo still hung above the entrance, faded and peeling under the sun. Lucas stepped out of the truck. Wind moved through the empty structure with a hollow echo. For a moment, it looked like the valley's story had truly ended. Most people saw a ruin. Lucas saw something else. He saw infrastructure, rail access, highway proximity, industrial power lines, warehouses, machines that had been left behind, and something even more valuable, space. Cheap space. The kind of space businesses in crowded cities could never afford anymore. Standing there in the silence of the abandoned factory, a strange idea began to form. What if the valley wasn't finished? What if everyone had left too soon? Lucas walked through the broken front gate. Dust covered the floors inside. Old equipment stood frozen in place. A single shaft of sunlight fell through a cracked roof panel, illuminating a line of dormant assembly machines. It looked like time had simply stopped. And that's when the idea became a decision. Lucas didn't see a ghost town. He saw an opportunity no one else was looking at. A place where land was cheap. A place with existing